So I just wanted to start off by introducing Dr. Becca Collins-Nelsen. Becca has been with MCYU now for almost 2 years. She is an instructor at McMaster University, but more importantly for me, she's an invaluable member of our MCYU team. She helps us with conducting research for MCYU. She's a sociologist by training. So, if you all remember, one of the things that I always used to prompt everybody to ask at the end of the lecture was why you do what you do. And so that doesn't mean you can't ask that again here. So, I think Dr. Collins-Nelsen will tell us a little bit about herself. You can see on the bio, she has a very interesting life. And maybe with that, we'll ask Dr. Collins-Nelsen to take over and get the lecture started.
Right on. Thank you so much, Sandy. So, welcome everybody. I'm so happy that everyone's here, and I'm really excited to be here myself. I've watched several MCYU lectures, but this is my first time actually giving one. So, this is a really fun day for me. So, as was mentioned, my name is Becca Collins-Nelsen, but you all are welcome to call me Becca. And you may have had a chance to already read some of the fun facts about me, but I thought I would read them out just in case you haven't. And also, it's a nice way that we can get to know each other a little bit as we spend this Saturday morning together. So, one of the fun facts is that I have family on the West Coast in Portland, Oregon, in the United States, and that is where my dad was born and raised. And I also have family in Montreal, Quebec, here in Canada, and that's where my mom was raised. But lucky for me, they found one another in a small Northern Ontario city called Thunder Bay. And that's where I had the pleasure of growing up. And Thunder Bay is full of a lot of nature, incredible hikes and views. So that was a lot of fun to grow up there. Another thing about me is that I really love sports. So I played competitive basketball growing up, and I play in a Hamilton Women's Hockey League currently. Although I should say that we are not playing this year, as I'm sure many of you have had your clubs and sports halted for the year. We have as well, but I hope to get back on the ice soon. And I also coach as a functional fitness instructor at a local gym called Odeon. I have done research on stand-up comedy, so that's always kind of fun. And as Sandy mentioned, thinking about why we've gone into the disciplines that we have or why we've studied the things that we study. For me, the stand-up comedy was partly because I think that laughter is a really very important part of life. And then the last fun fact about me is that I've had the same best friend since grade 4. So we've been really lucky that way to stay in touch throughout our entire lives. And her name is Kendra, and she lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So unfortunately, we're a little bit far away geographically, but we still talk almost every day. So that's really great. So, as was mentioned, today we're going to be talking about how do we know what we know? And we're going to consider this question and think about how we know what we know in terms of the information that we already know. But also, we're going to think about how we can continue to apply this question as we learn more and new information. So that's the idea of today. And I do want to do a quick netiquette slide, which is a fun way of saying online etiquette. So it's a combination of the words internet and etiquette. We can come back to this throughout lecture because it does show how what happens within our society and the words that we use change and evolve as there are other changes that exist within our society. So today we are, of course, communicating online. In this case, we're communicating over Zoom. And I have a feeling that you are all probably professionals at this by now because we've had to do a lot of our communication online these days. And I do know that Sandy briefly mentioned this, but I did want to just quickly remind everyone, if you could please keep your mics muted when you're not speaking, if you could raise your hand when you would like to speak, and also feel free to use the chat as we go along. So as Sandy said, I am going to have different parts throughout the lecture today where I'm going to ask you to respond and engage. But if you have any questions in between those times, do feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat and I can answer those as we go as well. Okay, so I've already told you a little bit about myself, but something that I haven't mentioned yet, although Sandy did briefly mention, is my academic background, what I went to school for many, many years. and that happens to be sociology. And so sociology is a social science that studies the development, structure, and functioning and dysfunctioning of a society. So in really simple terms, sociology is the study of society. So in order to really think about what that means and appreciate what that means, we're going to have to also understand what we mean by society. And so this is a group of people living in the same area in a more or less ordered community. So we all live in a society right now. So everything that's going on around you and your existence is part of that society. And sociology, or the study of society, is so much fun because society is all around us. So you can think of any kind of hobby you have, or interest, or anything that you've wondered about in terms of the society around you. And you can think about studying that from a sociological perspective. So maybe you're interested in cooking, or maybe you're interested in social media, or sports like I am, or movies, or board games. All of these topics can be studied from a sociological perspective. And in fact, all of them have been studied at some point or another from a sociological perspective. Another example might be video games or computer games. Does anyone here like to play video games or computer games? Raise your hand if that's something that is interesting to you. Right on. Lots of folks. I've heard that Minecraft is a popular one these days, so that's great. Perfect. So yeah, so a sociologist might look at video games to study how they create communities or how they create a sense of belonging. So that's really fun. Thanks so much, everyone, for putting up your hand. You can go ahead and lower your hands now. So part of studying sociology is learning how to use our sociological imaginations. And our sociological imagination is the capacity to shift from the personal experience to the societal and back and forth. And we're going to explain more about what that means and think about some examples. But this term, before we get on to those, this term was coined by a sociologist by the name of C. Wright Mills. And that's the man you see there on the motorcycle. And so Mills was a very interesting guy. He really loved to ride his motorcycle, which is why there are several photos of him on it. He was also a relatively big guy. He was 6'2", and he was known for having this really big appetite, along with all of the contributions he made to sociology. And he was also known for having 2 desserts after every one of his meals. So kind of a fun fact about him. But he coined this idea of the sociological imagination. And this is really about recognizing that our personal experiences are shaped by systems that exist in society and vice versa. So, for example, if someone were to try out for the Olympic skiing team and they didn't make it, it would not be enough to simply say that they didn't make the team because they are not good enough at skiing. That wouldn't be using your sociological imagination. In order to use your sociological imagination, you'd have to think more about how that personal experience for that person is also related to the broader society, which means that these explanations often become a lot more complex. So instead of just saying, oh, well, they didn't have the skill, they weren't good enough, we might also think about whether this person grew up in an area where there was lots of snow so that they were able to ski quite a bit. We might think about whether their family had enough extra money to purchase ski equipment and ski passes every year since that person was very young. We might think about whether the people around that person encouraged them to ski or whether there were some barriers to that. And we might also think about whether they had access to a ski coach or a ski team or some training, and many other things we could continue to think about when we consider that particular example. But the point is that it moves us away from a simple individual explanation to think about broader societal factors as well, and think about how they're implicated with that. And making that connection between the personal and the societal and back and forth, and think about the complexity and make those broader connections is a part of critical thinking. As is the question, the one that we're really trying to investigate today: how do we know what we know? And so This asking ourselves this question is also something that leads to critical thinking, and it makes sure that we're not taking information that we know for granted. So there's probably a lot of things that you all know, and you haven't actually considered, how have I come to know that? How do I know that? So, for example, a friend of mine is a kindergarten teacher, and she was explaining to me how difficult it is to teach young children how to line up. And I thought that this was so interesting and almost a little bit strange because as we get older, we line up so often that we don't even think of it as something that we at one point had to learn, right? It's not something that necessarily came natural to us, but this is something that we had to learn. So that's an example of something that until my friend shared that experience with me, I hadn't really thought, how is it that I know how to line up and when to line up? So I'm going to ask you all this question right now. How is it that you have come to know the information and the knowledge that you know?
Part of it is seeing the things that I know on the news by experiencing it. I
Uh,
mostly hear the news from my parents, and I just take that inside, basically just keep that in. So
yeah,
that's partially how I know most of my news. Talking to other people is another one.
absolutely. So talking to other people, your parents or your family, listening to the news or watching the news or reading the news. Absolutely. Those are all spots that we can get our information from. Is there anyone else who wants to share? Sounds like there was some responses in the chat as well.
Maybe newspapers.
Newspapers, absolutely. I still get the newspaper, the Hamilton Spectator, delivered to my home every day because I do like to look to the newspaper for how I get my knowledge and my understanding of the world around me.
Books maybe?
Books, absolutely. Yeah, books are definitely a great source for information, right? Even whether it's a fiction book, meaning that it's a story that's made up and not true, or if it's a book that's specifically supposed to be informative about a particular topic, either way, we can learn a whole lot from books, for sure.
I also see teachers, parents, and internet on the chat.
Yes, thank you, Sandy. Teachers, parents, and internet. So this is incredible. I think we've probably said in one way or another all of the ones that I was thinking about as well. So media on the internet, for sure. Our friends, right? We tend to spend a lot of time talking with our friends. And so we do learn from one another and each other. Books, as was mentioned, absolutely. School. So people talked about teachers, science, right? So science that we might consume through books or that we might hear about on the news or through friends. People we trust. So that was talked about at the very beginning as well. And that might be friends as well. It might be professionals. From research, right? So a lot of the stuff that Dr. Raha and I do at the university, that turns into information that we then make available to the public. And so that's another way that people get their information. Family, like was mentioned, parents or siblings or even extended family. The news, and that could be newspapers or the news that's on television or that happens through the internet. Teachers, as was mentioned. Scientists, so those are the folks that are usually coming up with the science, and then also experiencing it. So that was another important point that was brought up at the beginning. So absolutely, these are all of the ways that I thought about this is how I often know what I know. This list is not necessarily a list of every place or way that we have come to know what we know. But between all of us and the ones that I thought of, these seem to be some common areas for sure. So, based on this list, one of the things that we know is that we can't necessarily test all of the knowledge that we have in our head for ourselves. So, if someone says to you, kittens are soft, well, you could pet a kitten and you can decide for yourself if you agree with that statement or not. But there are things that we simply cannot test for ourselves. So even for, I know some of you come to many of the MCYU lectures, which is great. And you might think about some of the lectures that you've heard in the past from some professors who have presented here at MCYU. And oftentimes they're talking about things that they saw in their labs or through really expensive microscopes or things that they've tested on animals or things that we wouldn't necessarily always have access to or get a chance to see. Because a lot of us don't have our own labs where we could say, I wonder if I could test what they're saying and be able to use those same kind of materials. Another example of this is there are things that I believe to be true about our universe, such as the sun is the center of the universe and that the earth spins around it. But I have never been to space myself. I've never seen that with my own eyes. And in fact, I don't think I ever want to go to space. I'm sure some of you do, but for me, that's not something that I think I would be excited about. So the idea is that even though I haven't been there and I can't test it out for myself to see if that's how I see it and that's how I interpret things, I still have some beliefs based on that information. And so it's important to consider the framework through which the information is being presented, right? And I think that that idea is going to become more clear when we talk about our next slide, which is essentially a way of understanding that the way we understand the world around us will shape how we interpret information and events within our lives. So even if something is considered to be a fact, people may interpret that fact in very different ways. And I think that that becomes clear if we go through this story that I'm going to tell you. So this is a story that happens at different places throughout the world. So I'm not going to pick a specific location, but know this is something that actually does happen. But I'm just going to talk about it more generally and in a broad way. So essentially, sometimes when farmers plant their crops for the season, they also plant a dead fish with the seed or plant as an offering to the gods. And when the plants do well, they see it as a sign of thanks from the gods for the gift that they gave. So a biologist might look at this very same situation and see that the plants did well, but they might argue that the plants likely did well because the fish decomposed into the ground, which provided nutrients into the soil, which allowed the plant to grow well. And so in this case, we have two explanations for the same event, right? The outcome's the same. We know that we have a big, healthy plant that grew, but the explanations for why that happened are different. And so I'm just going to put a quick poll up, and I would like each of you to think about which explanation better explains to you why the plants did well. Is it the explanation that the gods were rewarding the farmers, or is it the explanation that the decomposing fish created nutrients for the soil? So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll right now. It should come up, and I'll give everyone, oh, folks are already filling it in. This is wonderful. I'll give folks a few more seconds here. Maybe we'll do half a minute more just to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to answer. We'll do 10 more seconds here. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and share the results with everyone. So within this group, we had 7% of us here agreeing with the gods were rewarding the farmers, and we had 93% agreeing with the decomposing fish creating nutrients for the soil. And so the truth is that there really is no right answer here, right? And the other truth is that it could be a combination of both of these things. But depending on how you view this is going to be based upon how you understand the world. And again, it brings us back to those frameworks. So if you're looking at this particular event through a framework of a scientist, like the biologist, then you probably have one explanation for the event. If you're looking at it from the lens of religion, then you probably have a different explanation for the event. And so this shows us that the same phenomenon can be interpreted in multiple ways. And in our society, often is, right? So thanks everyone for participating. I appreciate that. And we actually have another activity that I'm hoping you all will participate in right now. And so for this one, I'd like everyone to put 4 fingers in the air. And it's okay if your camera's off, you can just do this for yourself. So you've got 4 fingers. And I want you to put a finger down if you have seen someone do the following. And I'm going to read out 5 different scenarios. And if you've seen someone do it, then, or if you've done it yourself, go ahead and put a finger down, and we're going to see how many fingers we have left at the end of this activity. So number 1, have you seen someone say thank you if someone holds the door open for them? If so, go ahead and put a finger down. 2, have you seen someone smile and say hello when passing a stranger on the street? If you've done that or you've seen someone do it, go ahead and put a finger down. 3, have you seen anyone beep at a car that they thought did something wrong? Number 4, if you've seen someone shake someone else's hand when they first meet. And then lastly, if you've seen someone say, I'm sorry, if they accidentally bump into someone. All right, so go ahead and put your hand up if you have no more fingers up. Wow, we've got lots of folks who have no more fingers up. That's definitely what I anticipated. I also, in reading this list, have no more fingers up myself. So we can see that most of you don't have any more fingers up. So why do you think we have all seen these same things before? I'll give you all a second to put your hands down so I don't call on you in the event that you don't want to answer. There we go. So does anyone want to share what might be a reason that we've all seen these things before?
Can I try?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, basically, these are very generic things that happen to a lot of people. I can use like every single day. Common. It's not like it's something that's every day.
So your audio is a little bit choppy there. I'm not sure if everyone was able to hear you, but what I did hear was that these are pretty generic things. These are things that tend to happen every day, that these are relatively regular. So absolutely, I think that I agree with all of those, and apologies that I couldn't hear everything. It was a little bit choppy with the audio, unfortunately.
We experience it because it's common to hear people beeping on the street. You know, my family, my dad, you know, honks at someone when they're like going too slow or too fast. It's normal to see people hold the door for example, old people, and the old people would say, "Thank you, young man," and it's also normal to hear someone say, "Oh, I'm sorry," if you bump into someone. You know, it happens to everyone.
Right.
We're all a bit clumsy.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are all relatively common occurring events, and you gave some really great examples of when you've seen this before and who might be involved with these different events, and that's great. I completely agree. I think that is a big reason as to why we've all had the experience of seeing this.
Yeah, I think it's just expected and a norm in society. Just when you see someone, you know, on the street, you kind of acknowledge them and smile and just kind of wave at them. It's just, I think something we've all just been brought up to know to do.
Yeah, we've all just been brought up to know to do. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we tend not to question, right? Because it does feel so common and normal and regular. And so those answers were great and right on the money. And Daya, actually, you even used the word norm, which is exactly what we're going to get into now. These are all of the things that I just mentioned, that list that we just went over. These are called social norms. And these are often seen as being common sense things that we all just simply know. But of course, we don't all just simply know things, right? It's not that knowledge just enters us through some process of osmosis. These are things that we learn, but they're so common that we don't even necessarily notice when we learn them because they're so normalized in our society, which is where that word norms comes from. So these are the rules or standards of behavior expected of members of a group, society, or culture. And so some norms are unwritten or even unspoken about, but they're shared nonetheless. And social norms are different depending where you are in the world. And they can also change over time. And this is one of the reasons why we know that these social norms are socially constructed. So if there was only one right way to do things, or one natural or organic way, it would be the same all over the world, and it would be the same all across time. But we know that things change depending on where you go in the world, and that in terms of your expectations around standards of behavior change all over the world, and they also change throughout time. And so this lets us know that these things are socially constructed, meaning that they're constructed understandings of the world that we create and reproduce within our society. And often we don't even notice that we're doing them. So probably if you accidentally bump into someone and say, "Oh, I'm sorry," you don't think about how you're continuing a social norm that exists within our society, because it's so common for that kind of thing to happen. So for the most part, this allows us to share assumptions about reality and also share expectations of each other. But I do want to talk about how these things are different throughout the world and also at different points in time. So one of the things that tends to be different depending on where you are in the world is how one uses space. So space is often used differently in different parts of the world. In Canada, we are accustomed to giving people some space when we speak with one another. So even if you are speaking with someone and they're right in front of you, often if they get too close, you'll notice that the other person will take a step back, because we have a social norm that there is a customary space between people. We also tend to give more space when we're sharing physical locations with strangers. So we have a picture here of a movie theater, and you can see that even though all of these people could probably fit together if they sat all beside each other in the first 10 rows, they're spread out all over the theater. And that's very common in the context of Canada, right? If you are in a movie theater and you see that you walk in and there's just two other people sitting beside each other, you probably wouldn't go and sit right beside them, because we usually like to give folks space in Canada. And so in other cultures, like Spain, for example, we tend to speak a lot closely. They tend to speak a lot more closely to one another, so they don't have the same amount of space when they're speaking to each other. And they also tend not to leave as much space when it comes to sitting by strangers. So whether that's at a movie theater or if you get on a train or a public bus, people might sit right beside a stranger and not think as much about it. Another difference is the way that people greet each other in different cultures. So often in Canada, when we meet a stranger, shaking hands is a very common thing to do. But in other countries, like in France, it's common to kiss each other on each of the cheeks. Even if that person is a stranger and you're just meeting them for the first time. Whereas if someone were to do that in Canada, that might seem very odd because that's not part of our social norms. And of course, both of the things that I just talked about, space and how we greet each other, have changed due to COVID. And so this will be interesting to see if those changes continue. So this might be an example of how these social norms change over time. And regardless of the cultural expectations that used to exist, it might be that those expectations have changed or shifted because we've become so accustomed to giving more and more space and not necessarily touching one another for public health reasons. Another good example of something that's changed over time is the idea of smoking cigarettes. So it used to be socially acceptable to smoke inside public spaces. So it wouldn't be strange or uncommon to see someone smoking in libraries or in restaurants or even in airplanes. And once more information came out about the effects of secondhand smoke, the expectations around where cigarette smoke could happen changed. And so this includes policies and bylaws about where people could smoke cigarettes, but also the social acceptability around it has changed as well. So even sometimes in an open space, someone may frown at someone who is smoking near them. Another thing that's changed for many of us this year, and I know for many of you, is that we've had to do some school online. And so I'm wondering what norms changed for you when we went to online learning. What was something that you used to do in class that you don't do online, or something that you can do online that you weren't able to do in class? Can anyone think of any examples of that? For example, has anyone gone to school in their pajamas this year?
Well, if you're talking about online school, then yeah, I usually go in my pajamas, but if it was in regular school, I wouldn't be able to. Also, in virtual school, you don't really get to talk to your friends as much because the whole class is there. It's not like just a little bit of a private conversation. The whole class will listen. And also everybody wants to keep their mic has to keep their mic muted, so it's a little bit less social.
Yeah, those are all incredible points. And I completely agree with you. It's common. I'm actually wearing jogging pants right now. And if I was doing this presentation for you all live, I definitely wouldn't be in jogging pants. So I think that's something that's changed. I think you're absolutely right. The social aspect, when we're all in the same room together, it's really common in a big group for people to break off into smaller groups and chat with some of your friends over here and other friends are talking over here. And that's really not possible when we're all online together in terms of how communication operates here. So that really has changed some of the norms and the behavioral expectations, is that you can't just talk to your friend, even if you're on a break, because everyone can hear. Similarly, if we were in a lecture hall to do this lecture, I likely wouldn't have had a slide to remind everyone to be polite and make sure they don't speak when I'm talking, because I can trust that the social norms make it so that none of you would necessarily be talking over me as I'm speaking up at the front. However, online, it's an entirely different context. And so for that reason, as you've noted, a lot of folks have talked about how it's important to keep your mic muted, right? So that's just another way that this has changed. And social norms can change because we have new information, which is what happened in the case of smoking. It can change because we have new technology, which in some ways has happened with the online movement. But also, it's only been in the last 10 years that it's been so common for everyone to have smartphones. So that changed a lot of our social norms, right? When the smartphones first came out, it wasn't clear, is it rude to be on your smartphone all the time? When is it acceptable to be on it? When should we put it away? And so all those social norms needed to be renegotiated and adjusted as we had a new technology. And social norms can also change because people disagree with a social norm and they actually organize so that they try and change it. And this is really common if there's a norm that is considered to be unequal. So if there's something that is considered to be a social norm that supports a version of inequality in our society, sometimes people will get together and actively try and change those social norms and call out those social norms so that there's more accountability there. So another way that we can highlight what social norms are is by seeing what happens when we break them. And this is called a breaching experiment. And this is actually, Harold Garfinkel was famous for using breaching experiments as a version of teaching. So he was a sociologist and he was trying to teach his students about social norms. And so what he had them do is he had them actually break social norms and then observe how other people dealt with them around them. So an example of this might be if you're finishing up a conversation and you're about to go your separate ways, and instead of saying goodbye, you say, "All right, we'll see you later. Hello." Right? The person might stop and be a little bit confused and wonder why you've done that. The picture here is of an elevator, which may seem odd, but this is another form of a breaching experiment, is that you probably haven't even necessarily noticed this, but when everyone gets on an elevator, you tend to face the doors. So you're facing it just like we're facing this picture right now. So another breaching experiment is if you get on the elevator and you turn the opposite way, so your back is to the door. Again, people might look at you and think, what's going on here? A more maybe obvious version of a breaching experiment is if you walked into somewhere that had a lineup. So say you went to Tim Hortons and you marched right up to the front of that line and you ordered your food, right? People would certainly have something to say. Another example would be if you sit down with your family and you're about to have dinner and everyone's got their plate on their table and you take your plate and you put it on your lap and that's how you eat, right? So all of those are things that are out of the ordinary. And when they're going well, we don't even notice. You don't think, oh, interesting, that person has their plate on the table, right? Because it doesn't really register with us. But when those things are breached, that's when we end up recognizing the social norm themselves. Can anyone think of any other breaching experiments off the top of their head?
Going through the exit doors in a shopping mall?
Yeah, so if you went, like if you went in the exit doors, or if you went out
through the exit doors. Instead of entering through the entry doors, you went through the exit doors.
Exactly, absolutely. So that would be a breaching experiment, right? And people might react differently depending on if you did that, for sure. And actually, the reactions that people do have is exactly what we're going to talk about next. So this is something that we call sanctions. And the idea is that people react to how others follow or do not follow social norms through what we call sanctions. And sanctions can be positive or they can be negative. And so if someone supports the behavior that's happening, they'll usually provide a positive sanction. So this could be a smile, or it could be a high five, or it could be a supportive comment. Or sometimes if the behavior is supported, it's just nothing, right? Because we talked about how sometimes normal or normalized behavior can fly under the radar. And so people don't tend to notice it as much. However, if one does not support the behavior or is even offended that the norm has been violated, they would show a negative sanction. So this might be a glare or an eye roll or a frown. For example, how would you react if some of the scenarios that we've previously talked about happened? So what would you do if you were in line at Tim Hortons and someone came up to the front way ahead of you? Well, how do you think you might react? Would it be a positive or a negative sanction? And what would that look like?
I would probably be pretty upset.
Yeah, of course. That would be upsetting. How would you show that you're upset? Do you know how you might show you're upset?
Yeah. I would probably frown at them and ask what they were doing.
Yeah, so you might make a comment and ask why they've gone to the front, and also frown to show that this is something that is bothersome, for sure.
If someone was walking past me to get into the line and I had been there for a long time, I'd grab the guy by the arms, just swing him back into near the back of the line, just like, nope, you get back there.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
Just grab him. Nope.
Right. So the instinct would be to kind of stop them in their tracks, right? And of course, we wouldn't want to be violent with them, but we could maybe gently direct them back to the back of the line. Yeah.
I wouldn't just shove them. I'd be just no, you go back there.
Sort of guide them to that back of the line. Absolutely. Yeah. I think a lot of people might have that reaction to maybe let them know that that's unacceptable behavior, right?
I wouldn't beat on them. Never mind.
I'm happy to hear that.
Right, if someone interrupted me, I'd be, kind of really angry not really angry, but kind of angry from the inside. But of course, you'd be polite and you'd be like, "Good sir, I'm waiting in line. Could you go to the back, please?"
Yeah, absolutely. So you would still find a way to comment about it and provide a negative sanction, but in a way that's polite and kind. So in a way, you're yourself following the social norms to try and steer someone else back into following those social norms. So very interesting. Yeah. And that actually really connects with my next point. You all are so helpful in keeping me flowing through this. Which is another sociologist by the name of William Sumner. And he was really interested in looking at social norms. And in particular, he made a distinction between norms that you shouldn't do and norms that you must not do. So there's a difference in seriousness between the norms that he talks about. And he talks about two of them in particular. One is called folkways, and the other one here is pronounced mores. They almost rhyme in that way. That's how you can help remember that. So folkways are norms that govern simple day-to-day matters. So these could be things like manners and etiquette. So for example, if you were speaking with your mouth full, then maybe you're violating a folkway norm. And mores are norms that are taken very seriously. And so this might be something like murder or stealing. And often mores are usually involve the criminal justice system in one way, shape, or form. But again, just like social norms in general, both folkways and mores can change over time and place. And again, they change for the same reasons that social norms change. So it could be because there's more information about a particular topic. It could be because there's different technology that relates to those topics. It could be because of activism or people who have come together and decided that they're actively want to change some of these folkways or mores. And all of this stuff of thinking about how we know what we know and how this relates to social norms and common sense and where we get our information from is also related to the idea of objectivity and subjectivity. And so there are different beliefs at the university when it comes to whether someone should be more objective or more subjective. So objectivity means that you are not influenced by personal feelings or opinions when you're interpreting information. And subjectivity is essentially the opposite of that, which means that you are influenced by personal feelings or opinions when you're interpreting information. So in objectivity, this usually means that you only have room for one interpretation of a fact or of a experience or of an event. Subjectivity means that you often makes room for multiple interpretations of a fact or an event or experience. And so some disciplines in the university are far more invested in objectivity, and others have more of an appreciation for subjectivity. So to give you an example, the hard sciences, so things like biology, chemistry, and physics, those are often associated more with objectivity. Whereas many in the social sciences, like sociology, although not all, are more interested or have more of an appreciation for subjectivity. So for example, if we wanted to know more about cold weather, right? This is something that we often are curious about when we live in our society, which can have some pretty cold winters. So a hard scientist would think about what cold means and may understand it as being a temperature that's below zero, since zero has been constructed as being freezing on a thermometer. A social scientist may be more interested in how different people experience being cold. So there are a variety of different reasons why people find temperatures warm or cold, right? So subjective realities shape how we understand the world around us. And this can be based on a lot of things. It could be your belief system, your membership in certain groups, your experiences within the world, how you understand yourself. So for example, as I mentioned at the start of lecture, I come from Northern Ontario in a city called Thunder Bay, and it is very cold. It's known for being a really, really cold city. And so I consider myself as being pretty tough when it comes to experiencing the cold. And so I might be beside someone who says, oh, it's freezing here. And because of the way that I understand myself and my experiences and the world around me, I might say, oh, it's not too bad. I'm actually not that cold. And so a social scientist would be interested in the subjectivity around all of that in terms of how are people making sense of the world around them, regardless of what the actual temperature says. And lastly, because I know that we are running out of time here, but I do want to quickly talk about the relationship between knowledge and power, because this is another important consideration when we're asking ourselves how we know what we know. And a question that we want to accompany this question of how we know what we know is to consider, who does this knowledge benefit? So sometimes people have a personal and or a financial interest in promoting certain knowledge. So for example, if there's a company that wants to operate a really large factory in a city, they might have an interest in downplaying the environmental pollution that might come with opening their factory. It's also important to recognize that it takes power to get knowledge to be accepted, meaning that it's often people who are in positions of power in our society that have an influence on social norms and what is considered to be knowledge. And so that means that not everyone has the same opportunities to contribute to what we see as knowledge in our society. And that's a really another good reason why we should definitely consider the source of information that we get. And also, again, continue to question how we know what we know. And so I hope that you have gained some ideas and concepts and strategies and tools to start to think about how you know what you know. It's really important to become critical thinkers. This will help you throughout your entire life, not just in school, but in everything that you do. So I really hope that you all are able to take this and apply it. And I want to thank you all so much for spending Saturday morning with me. I super appreciate it. And I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, and we can go from there. Thanks, everyone.
Are there any questions for Becca? Maybe I can ask one question, and maybe, I don't know if he's still on the line, but he made a really interesting comment in the chat, and there was a lot of discussion in the chat around it. He said, common sense is a flower that doesn't grow in everyone's garden. And there was a lot of conversation around that. You wanted to share what you meant by that?
Well, basically, it's just the fact that not everyone's brain works the same way, and that's not a tool that everybody has in their brain. And I was just pointing that out. So
That's a really great point.
Yeah.
And that's exactly another reason why we need to maybe question what we often take for granted as being common sense, because you're absolutely right that not everybody understands exactly what common sense is in the same way. And so it is an interesting thing that we need to question and think about for ourselves, for sure.
You had a question?
I'm just going up to the chat here. Hang on a second. How do we think and know what we think?
How do we think and know what we think? Well, I think it takes a lot of reflection, right? And so we have to reflect on where did we get the knowledge, right? Because sometimes when we store something in our brain, we don't always remember exactly where we got that information from. So we'd want to think about the source of that information. We'd want to see if we've talked to numerous people about it. Have we talked to other people we trust about this information? And do they agree? Do they disagree? Have you had a back and forth conversation? You'd want to think about the framework that the information is coming from, right? Did you get this information from someone who's coming from a science perspective? Are they coming from a literary perspective, right? You want to think about what is the framework that this information came from and how is it being presented? So I think that that is really important as well. I also see that in the chat you wrote, how is common knowledge absorbed and learned? That is also a really incredible question. I'm so happy that you asked that. Sociologists are very, very interested in that very question. And they actually talk about a process called socialization. And socialization is essentially all the things that we learn by simply observing what is happening around us from immediately after we're born. And some people might argue even well before we're born. And so all of that information are things that we often are taking in and we're not always necessarily realizing it. So often, depending on the people you're around most, which is often your family, your close friends, your school and people around your school, those are really important agents, we call them, in socialization. And so that is a really neat concept. And I encourage you all to look more into that if you have an interest in it.
What are some of the findings that you found while researching stand-up comedy?
Yeah, so what I found essentially in researching stand-up comedy is that there's a lot of inequality that exists within stand-up comedy. And so there tends to be certain comedians that end up getting more opportunities and other comedians that end up facing more barriers. And there are a variety of mechanisms that actually work to sustain that model of inequality. So that was really one of my main findings. Also, I looked at how what we laugh at can showcase what our values are as a society. So if we laugh at a joke that's actually kind of a mean joke towards a group of people, what does that say about what we value as a society? So that was another research question that I looked at within my research on stand-up comedy, and in particular looked at comedy that is discriminatory or mean towards particular groups. Thanks for that question.
That was a great question. Yeah, and we have some comments in the chat about an example of changing a norm being the Black Lives Movement. So yeah, these are all really good comments, and it's exciting to see everybody posing these kinds of questions. And I think it's these questioning how we know what we have come to know is a really important exercise as all of you go through school and as we all go through life. And I think I really want to extend a big warm thank you to Dr. Collins-Nelsen for reminding us of that. Thank you, Becca.
Yeah, thanks everyone again. I appreciate it. And I can see from the questions and the comments in the chat, which I'll be able to look at more closely when we're done here, that there are many critical thinkers among us already, and that's really exciting and wonderful to see. So congrats. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for attending. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And we really look forward to seeing you next month for our lecture on April 24th. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
I just want to say this.
Mm-hmm.
I love these MCYU lectures.
Thank you.